once was moderating a panel in a room that sat 1,500 people. And it was the last day of a 5-day conference on a Saturday evening. And when we began, it was a panel of 5 people, and we outnumbered the people in the room. And there were 3 who were in the back row of this cavernous room, and then 2 sitting somewhere else. And I made the terrible mistake of suggesting that they come and join us in the front. It turned out all 3 of them were asleep. And when I woke them up, they all took one look and then fled the room. So we ended up, but I do hope that we will be very, very interactive here. I'm Tony Lake from UNICEF, and I was asked quite recently to moderate this panel and to introduce our subject. So I will do so. I should explain 2 things. I'm at the end of a long trip, and so I'm going to, I wrote out what I was going to say. But I think some of our panelists will be speaking from their seats. Some will be here, and this will all be very informal and I hope interactive. The other is that I'm a bit under the weather, and so I may go in and out of the room during the course of the panel. And if I leave, it will not be because of what anybody said, I assure you, but my being under the weather. Anyway, welcome, and I'm glad you're all here. The panel is about social stability, which must be, I strongly believe, an important theme of this whole forum, because social stability is about people. The people of Syria who've been displaced in their own land or living as refugees in neighboring countries, and the people of Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey and Iraq who have so generously welcomed them into their communities and homes. A sustainable solution to the crisis will only come from those people by investing in equitable access to quality services and promoting cohesion among them. That's just common sense. To discuss this and other aspects of our topic, let me introduce my fellow panelists. And in the order, well, just in no particular order. First, Neal Keny-Guyer, the CEO of MercyCorps. Her Excellency Reem Abou Hassan, Jordan's Minister of Social Development. William Swing, the Director General of IOM. Andreas Gies, Germany's Director General for Development Cooperation. And Nancy Lindborg, President of the U.S. Institute for Peace, and previously with AID. I thought Antonio Guterres' analysis this morning was particularly insightful because displacement is, in fact, a defining feature of this conflict. More than 80% of the 4 million Syrians who have fled their country now live within communities in host countries, not in camps. As the conflict rages into its 5th year, this influx not only changes the demographic balance in host countries, but it heightens tensions because of increased competition for limited resource and opportunities for land and water and housing and jobs. And host governments, of course, are struggling to meet this demand. Municipal and social services for health, education, sanitation, and housing are absolutely stretched to their limits, and in some cases beyond. And more, a lack of sufficient economic opportunities is resulting in a spike in poverty in communities that were already hugely disadvantaged and poor. As tensions rise, social cohesion and community security are at risk. Host governments not only cannot cope alone, they should not have to do so because the responsibility to invest in social stability, in education, in health, in protection, indeed in our common future, belongs to all of us, in our common interest. In Syria and across the region, there cannot be sustained peace without social stability. And let me argue this afternoon that there cannot be sustained stability without supporting the children living through the horrors of this protracted conflict. Stability tomorrow, built by preparing their bodies and their minds and their hearts today, preparing for their return to rebuild their country. Stability built by all of us in partnership, because this is not only in their interest, it's in all of ours as well. The reverberations of the conflict are, as we all know, being felt around the world, including the largest displacement of people since the Second World War, an influx of at least 800,000 and counting refugees into Europe, a river of misery. As any engineer will tell you, the most effective way to stem a flooding river is to build a dam at its source, at its headwaters, not at the bottom of the flood. This means not only doing more to support internally displaced people within Syria and refugees who have fled to neighboring countries, it means offering them the hope of rebuilding a Syria at peace, a stable Syria in a stable neighborhood. And there's no doubt that these children want to return. I often think of 3 children that I met in the Bekaa Valley a few years ago in Lebanon. The little girl who I met who was clutching this little paper doll that she had made. And she asked her, or I asked her, what was the name of the doll. She gave me the name, and she said that was the name of the doll that she had left behind in Syria, and that she desperately wanted to return home to her home and her doll. I think of the drawing that a little boy in that same neighborhood showed me, a picture of clouds, mountains, a river, and most importantly, a house, his home. And I think of that boy's older sister. When I asked her what she wanted most, if she could have anything she wanted in the world, she replied without hesitation, I want to go home to Syria. 3 children. 3 among the over 8 million Syrian children inside and outside Syria whose futures are jeopardized by this brutal conflict, each among the 4 million Syrian refugees who have fled the fighting, running from bombs and mortars and airstrikes and snipers and kidnapping and exploitation, longing to return home. These children and the millions like them can be agents of progress and stability for Syria, but only if they get the education they need to shape their minds and build their skills, and only if they get the protection and the counseling and the support they need to heal their hearts. Stability comes, yes, from building institutions and infrastructure to support our society's ambitions, and it comes from statistics about job numbers for youth, about numbers of children who are educated, and about current and future economic progress. But in the end, it's not institutions or infrastructure or statistics that decide a society's fate. It is people who decide. Without resilient people, there cannot be resilient development. What will be the ability and willingness of these people to take advantage of educational and economic opportunities, and to translate these opportunities into better, more stable futures for themselves, for their families, for their communities, and ultimately for their whole societies? What will be in the hearts as well as the heads of the children and youth in Syria and in the camps and communities of its neighbors? The people and governments of host countries have opened their doors and their hearts, from absorbing them into local schools by introducing double shifts to meet the demand, to attempting to address language and curriculum barriers, to exploring skills and language training, and even incentives to businesses to hire Syrian youth. These governments and donors from around the world recognize that every child we educate, every heart we heal, becomes a building block of stability for the future, so that when the conflict ends, these children have the education and skills that can strengthen their nations, the ability to help rebuild their communities, and the civic spirit of goodwill, cooperation, and amity that lies at the heart of any healthy, peaceful, resilient, stable society. That's why 2 years ago, a group of partners came together to launch the No Lost Generation initiative to safeguard the future of children inside Syria and in host countries by giving them education and protection. Since the initiative began, over 900,000 children inside Syria and another 500,000 in neighboring countries have accessed some form of education. This includes innovative efforts such as our partnership with UNRWA to deliver a self-learning program based on Syrian curriculum to children in all parts of Syria itself. And over 1 million children and adolescents in Syria and in host countries have received counseling and support. But so much more needs to be done. Despite the efforts of host countries, less than half of the school-aged Syrian children taking refuge in their countries are actually getting an education, less than half. And within Syria, 2 million children are out of school, and another 400,000 are at risk of dropping out. Why? Well, one of the reasons is that 1 out of 4 Syrian schools has been damaged, destroyed, or is being used for military purposes. Most outrageously, schools are under attack. Last year alone, the UN verified 60 attacks on schools in Syria. Some were deliberate, and the actual numbers may be much higher this year. As the security situation worsens and as the conflict endures, the needs increase. And the needs change also because especially the problem is that the children themselves are growing older, which is why the next phase of No Lost Generation is not only focused on education and protection for children, but on the specific and practical support that adolescents and youth need. Skills training, entrepreneurship opportunities, expanded learning spaces, and new tools to reach more children, and policies that give Syrian youth the opportunity to engage with, to contribute to their communities and to those hosting them. So we must not only save children's lives in the short term, we must prepare the bodies and the minds and the hearts of those who can one day restitch the fabric of their torn societies, as citizens and as leaders. Future leaders like the 2,700 young Syrians who have made their way to university in Turkey this year. Who hope to return one day to Syria as tomorrow's doctors and engineers, technicians, teachers, lawyers, and architects. Future leaders like those children still living in Syria, 20% of whom had to cross checkpoints and active lines of combat to take their exams. A fierce commitment to gain an education, to build a better tomorrow for themselves and for their country. And future leaders like the girl with the paper doll, the boy drawing pictures of home, and his sister with her unshakable determination to go back to Syria one day. These children, tomorrow's citizens, need our support today. Most of all, they need this war to stop. We cannot lose this generation, and as the Prime Minister said, future generations of children to endless, brutal carnage. Let us meet their plea for peace with a renewed and sustained demand for a solution that will end the suffering and give these young leaders what they most want of all, an opportunity to lend their hands and their hearts to rebuilding their shattered nation, to go home. So let me call now on our various panelists. I'll go and sit down and start to act like a moderator. Then I hope after each of them has 10 minutes or so to speak, that you will be offering your opinions, and then we will go around to the panel again and then wrap it up. So thank you very much. So first, Bill Swing. Thank you. Aren't you lucky I said it was you when you were standing here?
Thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I think what I would like to do in my short time is offer some living examples of lessons learned when we didn't have resiliency in our policy as we go through these remarks. Just a very brief introduction. I'd like to make 3 points and then sit down. I mean, the figures in Syria are so well known that it's become almost a numbing factor for us that we add the additional numbers in. But as we know, in the 5th year of this horrible war, We have half of the country in some pattern of displacement, either refugees or forced migrants of another nature. More than 250,000 Syrians, of course, have lost their lives. Syria has gone from being a middle-income country to one that is largely dependent on aid and lives in poverty. But we must also recognize that we are in a period of unprecedented conflict, disasters, from the western bulge of Africa across to the Himalayas, with very few bright spots in between, Jordan being one of them, thank goodness. We are in a period of the greatest forced displacement since the Second World War, drawing on UNHCR statistics. A period of anti-migrant and anti-foreign sentiment. International humanitarian law is being violated on all sides. There's been a serious erosion of international moral authority. There are very unclear power relationships in the world. And in addition to all of that, apart from the talks that are going on in Vienna now, and let's hope they go well, I'm unaware of any other viable negotiations or viable political processes that offer any of us any hope for a resolution of any of these. So humanitarians have to continue their work, even knowing that there's no humanitarian solution. So I think we find ourselves in the midst of something that my former boss and mentor, Tony Lake, taught me on one of his many trips to Haiti, that we're in the middle of a perfect storm, with what I've just described to you, with not only the Syrians in the refugee camps, twice as many displaced persons inside, and large numbers heading north. I was glad to hear this morning in the discussion, particularly from the High Commissioner, we all share the same view. The world has never given sufficient recognition to the great generosity of Syria's 4 neighbors, and in 2011, Libya's 6 neighbors, all of whom kept their borders open at great expense to their nation and their people. And we must never forget that. I hear very often, because we're in frequent dialogue with the European Union, trying to help them to move from saying this is a problem to be solved, and we're saying no, it's a human reality that has to be managed. Let's look at practical measures. And I'm often hearing our European colleagues saying they're surprised at all these people are coming north. I say, well, I'm surprised for 2 very different reasons. I'm surprised they didn't start coming north sooner, and I'm surprised that the numbers aren't larger. You cannot have that much conflict on your southern and eastern borders, abject poverty, political persecution, without expecting large numbers to come north. So we want to give great credit to our host today and the other neighbors. Now, social stability is very much intermixed with all of this. That's what it's all about. I wanted to make just 3 points then. The commitment to resilience that we all have to make. Secondly, the resilience of commitment. And thirdly, resilient partnerships. Given an overwhelmed humanitarian system, we simply have to move beyond the fire brigade approach and try to come up with more innovative, resourceful, and resilient approaches. This is brought on by a number of challenges I've already partially mentioned: the protracted nature of the Syrian conflict, the large numbers of people who continually come forward and need humanitarian assistance, the profound impact of the war on the neighboring countries, the growing pressures in neighboring host governments and communities. So we have to go beyond an exclusive focus on relief as such. We need to build resilience into our relief efforts and come out of our various silos to work as much as we can together. Second aspect, apart from changing our approach, we have to integrate resilience into our crisis responses. I want to give you 2 examples of how we didn't do it. First of all, Libya. March of 2011, the High Commissioner calls me on a Sunday afternoon, says, Bill, this conflict is bigger than both of us. We better get together. We invited the ambassadors downtown the next morning, Monday. Said, we're going to need your support. We have a lot of people who need to be evacuated from Libya. We went down to the border there, and in the end, together with UNHCR, IOM, we evacuated 250,000 people to 54 countries at a cost of $125 million. And we felt very good about that. We got accolades for it. When we reflected on it afterwards, we didn't do a very good job. We did the job halfway. What did we do? We dropped 177,000 sub-Saharan Africans off back home in West Africa. There were no jobs. That's why they left home to start with. That's why they were in Libya. Schools were inadequate. Health services were inadequate. And there were no more remittances by definition because there were no more jobs. So in trying to solve an immediate crisis, we created a larger crisis. That is not resilience. So we learned from that, and we came up with something called the Migration Crisis Operational Framework, which is like a circle. It has 15 steps in it. Next time, we have to be much better linked up with all of our UN partners, NGO partners, private sector, and others who can help. So we have to have a strategy that includes resilience from the very outset. Second example is Haiti. And here I'm coming forward a bit to the January 12, 2010 earthquake. We learned that in a resilient approach, the bridge, if you will, between and among the various phases of a crisis, where you move to post-conflict, post-crisis, into development, that bridge is much longer and much murkier than some of the very well thought out UN categories and phases would make you believe. We still have 75,000 people living in tents in Haiti. Is Haiti out of the emergency? Is it only doing development? No, of course. It's doing several things at the same time, and we need to learn from that. And did we build back better? I think the jury's out on that one also. So we need to understand that in both cases, Haiti and Libya, we needed a more comprehensive, holistic, long-term strategy that we would have needed this from the very outset. So in solving an immediate problem, we don't unwittingly create a larger one. I would have to say that as I look back on a long career, I don't think you have any difficulty recognizing that, long career, that the greatest single frustration I have had is that we simply don't, we start and we never really finish what we went in to do. Now, I can understand that in budgetary terms and the various conflicts that are out there, but we simply have to find a way to stay the course until we can help conflict areas to build capacity and resilience. I said some time ago that while I was very committed to zero Ebola in the Mano River Union, I had one greater concern, post-zero Ebola, because I knew what was going to happen. Although we got the pledges out there, we're probably going to walk out before those countries have been able to build a health system that would make them much more capable the next time an epidemic comes along. Second point on the resilience of commitment, have a single illustration here. Well, first of all, I think resilience of commitment has partly to do drawing on our diaspora communities who are resilient. In fact, during the worst economic downturn, remittances actually go up, money sent home to help those who are in need. The diaspora, when we had 150,000 Ethiopians kicked out of the Gulf and went home, hundreds of thousands of dollars came from the Ethiopian diaspora community abroad. That is resilience. We need more of that. The other thing, and then this point I would make, is that you can have all the resilience you want if you don't have a resilient partner in terms of political will on the part of the host governments you're trying to support. The DRC is perhaps a pretty good case. The UN peacekeeping mission arrived in December of 1999, and they're still there, almost 16 years later, but certain things haven't happened. The local and provincial elections never happened. The army reforms really were never fully completed and didn't work. So we have to be resilient in terms of seeking resilient partners, and that is my next and final point, is resilient partnerships. Delivering as one requires resilient partnerships. It cannot be delivering as one once. It's got to be delivering as one all the time. So the complexity and protracted nature of the Syrian situation demands that we have more comprehensive adaptive programming and to include NGOs, the civil society, the private sector, and other partners. Finally, I would just say that we must continue to draw lessons from conflicts we've been in and to apply those in a resilient manner. Thank you.
Mr. Gies. And feel free either to go up or to sit, whichever you wish.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. 1 year ago, in Berlin, the international community pledged to combine humanitarian aid and development cooperation as a basis to create more resilience for Syrian refugee and host communities. And in Berlin, Jordan was invited to present best practice in the crucial water sector. And early on, humanitarian and development cooperation agencies were regularly coordinated by the different Jordan bodies. Well done. Good job. But 1 year on, the international community still has to prove that its intentions and commitments are going to be transformed into concrete action. Recently, in October, new donor support was landed via the World Food Programme to increase the value loaded on electronic voucher cards. And just to give you some, to my mind, impressive figures, the average value per month and per capita is now at $21, which means 80% of the full intended voucher value. And this is a positive development, but everything is relative. Positive because the assistance has been cut down to 50% previously, which is unacceptable. And funding through VFP means that you also support local economy by local sourcing of food, by having value-added tax going back to the budget of the economy. And this is also an aspect how to contribute to stabilization and resilience of a stressed economy. Let me refer to the key questions put up to our panel. From a development cooperation perspective, host countries are in the lead for shaping the policies, for addressing issues of resilience, inclusiveness, and social cohesion in their country. And as far as questions of entitlement are concerned and opportunities for refugees, This is at the very core of political decision-making. Especially if it goes beyond the immediate legal obligations of a country. For example, as far as the access to education is concerned, or the access to the labor market. The host country's role is to allow access and create opportunities. And the role of the international community is to support the host countries and to carry out their responsibility in fast and concrete and flexible action. Now, within the 5th year after the beginning of the crisis, the challenge is different than at the beginning. We need to seek for enduring solutions. Even so, sometimes we only can bridge a difficult period with the hope of having a political solution. In 2012, Germany pledged for a 3-year period a commitment of at least 500 million euro on a bilateral basis. And since 2012 to 2014, more than 1 billion euro has been implemented, out of which, and I think this is important to mention the different instruments with which we implement our development cooperation and humanitarian aid. 500 million euro was humanitarian aid and transitional aid, and 480 more or less development cooperation, and into addition 87 for conflict prevention. And I think it's worth mentioning that we cope with this crisis with different instruments which we have further developed, which are quicker than in previous times in order to be responsive. We cope with the crisis in a twofold approach. On one hand, we address the beneficiaries, as beneficiaries, the Syrian refugees, and on the other hand, the population of the host communities, and we do this in a very, very balanced way. And recently, our minister has announced an additional winter package, which is a quite comprehensive one, and part of it is 130 million euro, which is dedicated to the Syrian crisis. I say part of it because there are, unfortunately, other crises currently which have to be addressed also, parallelly. And with this fast response, we reacted to calls from UNICEF, from WFP, from UNDP. And the measures will still be implemented in 2015. Thus, providing health care to more than 2 million people in Iraq, food cards to 750,000 people in Iraq and Lebanon, and basic education to more than 120,000 children in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Now, at this time, the resilience agenda is sensible and timely. And let me refer to some concrete examples of our approach in development cooperation, combining it and dovetailing it with humanitarian aid and transitional aid, which has been considerably increased in the current year and which will still be increased more in the next budget year. Recommendation number 1, predictability, longer-term funding. As I said, Germany pledged a minimum level of commitment for a 3-year period of 500 million euro. And if you look, for example, at our bilateral cooperation with Jordan since 2012, we committed 559 million, out of which 233 million is humanitarian aid and transitional aid, and 326 million is development cooperation to address and begin at the same time measures with different timelines addressing needs which are immediate, which are medium term, and which is very important, which are long term, like in the water sector. Recommendation number 4, strengthen local capacities. For us, it's important to align with the country strategies, and Jordan is a very good example with a national plan. So we fully align our cooperation and fit it into this national plan. Recommendation number 5, expand use of program-based approaches for basic service delivery. Now, tomorrow, we are going to hold government negotiations with Jordan. And we are looking into a key sector to address resilience, which is education and jobs. It's about education and jobs. And we envisage a very, very comprehensive approach with our Jordanian partners, including national government, private sectors, unions, and other stakeholders. Recommendation number 10, start work to enable future reconstruction and recovery. Now again, a good example is our cooperation with Jordan. And it's really worth mentioning. We started last year with full scholarships for master studies at the Jordanian University for an intake of 40 students, 50% women, and 50% Syrian refugees and 50% Jordanians. And we continue on a yearly basis with this program. And it's maybe also worth mentioning that 60% of these scholarship holders pursue voluntary social work in the districts where they live, and thus actively contribute to foster a society in peace and with less conflict. And another example is our long-standing cooperation with UNICEF, which is setting up a national agenda for future of Syria, bringing together a whole broad range of stakeholders to design an inclusive agenda for reconstruction and reconciliation in a hopefully soon phase of post-conflict, and to achieve a transition in an orderly process. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to give you these concrete examples because I think in bilateral cooperation, and I am responsible in the German Ministry for bilateral cooperation, we have quite in the last years further developed our instruments to be responsive to the current crisis. And it's worth always mentioning figures because It counts for every single refugee and every inhabitant of host communities. And in difficult times, we are aware that we cannot solve all problems, but we can be helpful in supporting the perspectives for jobs through education, and we can be helpful in bridging the time until a hopefully very soon post-conflict phase is going to come where reconstruction is needed and skilled people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Nancy, would you like to offer your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. And now begins the seated portion of the program. I really do feel like we're the mop-up crew here. It's great to be here with everyone. And, looking out over the audience, I can tell that many of you here are deeply involved with these issues, and all of us have been having this conversation for a long time. I remember in 1996 attending a conversation convened by Madame Ogata about closing the gap. And this fundamental issue that all of us have struggled with has had a lot of names over the years. And I think the good news is that, flash forward to where we are today, there's broad agreement to the core principles. And I think the resilience agenda that's being circulated for this conference really captures beautifully and eloquently the critical concepts that are the fruits of a lot of experience, of a lot of joint commitment by many of us here in the room. One of the reasons that I am enthusiastic about the latest incarnation of this concept as resilience is that we have always struggled with, what is it, humanitarian development? Are we bridging the gap? Are we closing the gap? Is it sequenced? Is it what's the temporal dimension here? And resilience is fundamentally about having a shared goal and understanding that it is a desired outcome. And we've heard various definitions, all of which are quite close. But fundamentally, it's doing things differently. It's understanding that we need to get ahead of these shocks with our development funds, and we need to be focusing both our humanitarian and our development on this shared goal. I think we've, just since 2011, when many of us re-engaged with this issue around the droughts in the Horn of Africa and then 2012 in Sahel, there have been some really important advances. And I was recently with USAID, where those droughts prompted a whole different way of USAID to think about joint planning cells, analyses that brought people around the table to problem solve instead of just putting their tools on the table. It is fundamentally more complicated to do that in a conflict environment. So while we've had, I believe, important collective progress within agencies and among agencies in natural disaster situations, with a lot of effort through the years on incorporating the risk of disaster into our fundamental development approaches, we still, I believe, have a significant challenge when we think about applying this in a conflict environment and with refugees, because you can't necessarily, as we've heard over the last 2 days, fundamentally incorporate the refugees into your development plans. There are all manner of issues depending on the host country's situation and the politics of this. So the question is, how do we move forward in a time, as we've heard, and I appreciate all of the laydown of the statistics and the situation, so I won't repeat that, but at a time when we're at a critical global strain on the humanitarian system, where you've got 4 civil wars just in this region alone, not to mention the arc of crisis through the Middle East and Africa. There's simply not enough money in the system to do what needs to be done. And so how do we fundamentally change our business model so that we can deal with the crises that are upon us and do it in a way that changes our development focus as well as what we do with our humanitarian money. And think about the risks that we need to be addressing as opposed to just focusing our development on productive capacity. Because what we're seeing is over and over again, whether it's natural disasters on the one hand or conflict that undermines development progress and results in the kind of conflict, the kind of refugee flows, and the kind of continued poverty that we're seeing in this arc of crisis and arc of fragility. So we've made a lot of progress, and I want to really, really applaud everyone in this room, in this region, and the governments. I mean, this is really extraordinary. And I want to just note that as we look forward, and especially as we think about the World Humanitarian Summit coming upon us, what are some of the issues that we really collectively are going to need to wrestle with to move this into the next phase? Because one of the things to be really cautious about is that resilience doesn't become its own stovepipe, that you think of it as a funding column that is its own distinct approach. You've got your humanitarian and your refugees over here and your development over there, and oh, look, there in the middle is resilience. And it just we saw this a little bit with the whole concept of transition, that it became its own funding approach. And if we do that, all we do is take the pie and cut it into smaller slivers, as opposed to making the totality work together for greater impact overall. We still have a lot of silos to worry about, where the funding comes out through some significant silos that have been 50 years in the making based on an understanding for the expertise involved with this work, but not at the same time understanding some of the innovations that have been laid down that enable a leaner platform. And thank you, Andreas. I think you were the one who talked about the uses of debit cards, for example, where you don't need each agency to have its own debit card, but rather, I think as we've seen in this region, a common use so that you can really reduce the footprints and increase the efficiencies of our aid dollars. There are more things that we can do along those lines. Similarly, the harmonization of, from the donor end, the requirements from the implementing partners, the kind of approaches, this significant harmonization on both sides will be absolutely critical. And all of this will help us enlarge the base. What we really haven't talked about over the last 2 days is the importance of getting a broader donor base, because we have, through the traditional donors, we are at record levels of funding, but there's still enormous gaps. And part of that is non-traditional donors don't trust the system. They may not be investing in the new resilience plans, just like they haven't been investing in the system that's been in place for a while. So how do we increase the confidence through greater transparency, more efficiency, so that we can do that? The second point I want to make is that we need to really focus in on the risk of conflict. So as we think about resilience and we think about changing how we do our development, is front and center is thinking about how to invest at an individual level, at a community level, and at a country level in ways to manage the kind of conflict that is inevitable. We're always going to have conflict in any kind of society, in any kind of community, and managed well, it can even be transformative. Not managed is when it becomes violent and undoes years and years of development gains. This should not be something that's done as an add-on, but really fundamental to how we do our work as a part of building resilience to the shock of violent conflict. We heard yesterday from one of our speakers that the lack of reconciliation in Iraq is one of the reasons that despite billions of dollars of investment in development, it's been overturned with the latest conflict. And the absence of reconciliation really at all levels in Iraq will fundamentally constrain the development gains from taking hold. A quick story, and Lise knows this story well, is that in Tikrit in Iraq, When Daesh swept in, they massacred about 1,400 Iraqi soldiers, most of whom were Shia. So the Sunni families in the area fled, not only because they were afraid of Daesh, but because they were also afraid of the retribution that would inevitably come from the Shia tribes who would hold them accountable as well for the massacre of their tribes' family members. So a group of Iraqi facilitators got together to work with both the Shia and Sunni tribal leaders for the purpose of sharing information, setting up an agreement that they would not lapse into tribal retribution, but rather use criminal justice for the individuals who were proven to be involved. And this resulted in a peace that not only kept future cycles of conflict from happening, but enabled the beginning of the return of families. Initially 400 families, and now the figures vary, but maybe close to 100,000 people have returned to Tikrit. That's the kind of approach that we need to be thinking about at every level. My final point is just, we celebrated the successful completion of the Millennium Development Goals in September at the UN General Assembly. And as we set forth the global goals for the next round, the heartbeat, in my view, is Goal 16, which really calls upon countries to commit to accountable justice, to peaceful societies that have accountable, inclusive institutions at every level. It's about accountability. It's about inclusivity. This is key to resilience. This is key to development. This is key to how we think about our humanitarian assistance. But as we talk about Marshall Plans and as we talk about a development increase, that's got to be the guiding principle and the requirement on the mutual compact in which all of us engage. Because without this, we're going to continue to have the kind of non-inclusive governance that rips societies apart over and over again and continue this upward need of assistance that the globe just absolutely can't afford anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Neal, a view from civil society?
Great. Thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everybody. And I just want to add again, we up here drew the short straw, so that prize session right after lunch and late afternoon when everyone's, oxygen in the brain is getting less. But you guys look great. I just want to assure you from out there. So thank you. I appreciate that. And I want to start by thanking UNDP and the Kingdom of Jordan for bringing us together around this important issue. I would go as far as to say that the Syrian crisis in all of its dimensions, maybe alongside climate change, and we all hope our colleagues are going to do a good job on that next month in Paris, but alongside that, this is the top global issue. And I so appreciate the way the minister this morning framed it, that Jordan and the other frontline countries, really have performed a global service, a global good, in the welcoming and the work that they've done to host all the refugees and to help the world to manage this crisis. But we all know we have to do more. My own organization works in all the frontline countries as well as inside Syria, and over the course of our work, we have touched 5 million Syrians at some point or another, including 500,000 on a monthly basis inside the country of Syria right now. So we have a firsthand experience of more that we can do, particularly in the resilience context. And I agree with everything that Nancy said about the importance and the excitement of resilience, but I do think we need to be careful. I don't know how many of you, kind of like me, as we listen to a lot of the rhetoric around resilience, do we go, gosh, is there really something new here? Or are we just repackaging some of our best practices and lessons learned in new language? But I actually think it's both. So I wouldn't be cynical about the language. I do think that now a focus on thinking longer term, overcoming silos, looking at root causes, focusing on systems, not on projects. That's important, and that is different. And we push ourselves to embrace it and push beyond the language. I think we'll get to a better place, and that's critically important. And for sure, one thing, resilience everywhere means coming together, bringing together of government, private sector, and local communities. That's everywhere. And how often have we not done that in the past? Not only do we silo kind of relief to recovery to development, but we silo government work, community work, private sector work, and we don't get the benefits that we all need. So I want to highlight, I think, 3 critical issues that are very important to when we think about resilience. So the first issue to me is that I think if we're looking in this, we have to increase and strengthen the work inside Syria. I do think there's so much more that can be done there. And we need to change our approach. We need to focus more on market systems. There are a lot of farmers in Syria right now, in government-controlled areas and in opposition-controlled areas. Farmers who are producing food. We need to figure out how to leverage those food systems. One of the things that does work in Syria in many places are markets. There's way more we can be done. So let's don't think in terms of bringing in a bunch of food or a bunch of stuff, because there are markets inside Syria that if we're more innovative, we're more clever, they can be made to work much better on behalf of the people there. There are incredible community organizations. We all know that. Again, let's don't be hung up on what happens out of Damascus, what happens, through other channels. It's from wherever, however, focused on strengthening local capacity in Syria and leveraging market systems. That ought to be the lens that we use. The second critical issue that I would say, and this relates even more in terms of the host countries who, again, I think have been nothing short of heroic and need tremendous more support from the international community. But a lot of that support for me would be, let's use a governance lens. The frontline responders, whether in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, these are local municipalities, local government entities. If we can channel our focus and our attention and our investment through those entities and work with them to be the conveners, again, of private sector, communities, local groups. And we've seen examples of that from Lebanon, from Jordan here in Mafraq. We've all been up and probably have seen these examples. When you work through local government in imaginative ways, they solve problems. It's not abstract, right? This is on the front lines of where aid, the rubber meets the road, as they say, where the investment matters most to the people for whom we care so much about on that. And I do think what is critically important, because in all these surrounding communities, the issue of refugee and host community tensions is real. So bringing in a dispute resolution lens, a conflict management lens, whatever we call that, is absolutely critical. And my own organization and other organizations with a lot of support and work with local governments have seen the benefit, the conflicts avoided and reduced because we've taken that approach. And then the third critical issue that I would just highlight if we want to get at the essence of resilience, and I would come back to Tony Lake as he started in his remarks, and that is use a youth lens, focus on youth. And my own observation, and there needs to be more to be done, there's been more organized attention for youth up until about age 12, 13, but we're seeing a big gap in terms of adolescents and teens. And we all know that's that critical stage in life where young people begin to assess risk, to develop the ability to make decisions, to critical life choices. But these young people, as we've seen, have been in survival mode for so long that there's a critical inflection point now. Will they go on and develop those skills and thrive, or will they dive? And I really think we're at that inflection point. Not only that, but the evidence is clear. We're now seeing through biomarkers, brain chemistry, saliva scans, you're seeing that extra cortisol in adolescent brains because of all the stress. And we're also learning that a sports program alone doesn't impact that very much. An arts program alone doesn't impact that very much. It's a comprehensive program that blends sort of psychosocial, community-based interventions with things like life skills and work skills to go forward. But we need to bring that intentional, deliberate focus on youth is important, and particularly that critical age group in those teen years. And then the final thing that I would say is I want to come back to one of the principles in the Resilience Development Forum paper on all of our seats here that I think is critical. And, you know, I have a hard time sometimes keeping 10 interventions and 5 principles right, so I like to uphold one big one. And I do think the most important one is the one that says prioritize dignity and self-reliance, because I do think if we take that seriously and prioritize that, you know, then we see this crisis, you know, not in sort of an abstract way, but again, the way that Tony started out, we see it in the context of 3 real children, or real people that we categorize as brothers, sisters, mothers, or fathers. And when we do that, if we get the dignity piece right, somehow I feel the rest will follow. Thank you.
Well said, Neal. Thank you. In baseball, including my beloved Boston Red Sox, you put your best batter last to clean up and score all the runs. The minister is asked to speak last, and the floor is yours.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أرحب بكم في الأردن، هذه الأرض المباركة بقيادتها الهاشمية التي تفتح دوما ذراعيها لكل محتاج يبحث عن الأمن والأمان. أتحدث إليكم اليوم في ذكرى مرور 10 سنوات على تفجيرات عمان. هذه التفجيرات التي أعطتنا كأردن أن نمارس الصمود الريزيلينس الذي نتحدث عنه اليوم. يعد الأردن من الدول متوسطة الدخل، وهذا يعني بالضرورة وجود مؤسسات وطنية، وأن سيادة القانون أمر واقعي وليس من وحي الخيال، وأن هناك مجتمع مدني نشيط، وأن هناك برامج وأنشطة وقواعد بيانات يمكن الوثوق بها، وأن هناك قطاع خاص له مكانته ودوره في بناء الوطن وتنمية المجتمع. في ظل كل هذا جاءت الأزمة السورية، وتفاجأنا نحن في الأردن أن ردود الفعل الأولى في التعامل مع الأزمة السورية كانت بتنحية الجمعيات المحلية والمؤسسات الوطنية النشيطة واستبدالها من قبل المانحين بمنظمات وجمعيات أجنبية لتقوم بدور تعودنا نحن في الأردن من خلال مؤسساتنا وجمعياتنا أن نقوم به. ولكن ومع ذلك إلا أن الحكومة الأردنية قامت بإعداد خطة الاستجابة الوطنية للأزمة السورية لتقدم برنامج مدته 3 سنوات حتى يكون لنا أن ندعي أن لنا الملكية الأونرشيب في هذا البرنامج. فيها الخطة الاستجابة الوطنية المشاريع ذات الأولوية كجزء من استجابة الحكومة لتأثير الأزمة السورية، وتمثل هذه الخطة محاولتنا لتقييم الآثار المترتبة على هذه الأزمة في القطاعات الأساسية من صحة وتعليم وإسكان وطاقة وبيئة وحماية اجتماعية وغيرها من القطاعات، بالتركيز على المحافظات والمجتمعات الأكثر تضرراً من خلال اتباع النهج التشاركي الذي تعودنا عليه في حل مشكلاتنا خاصة الاجتماعية منها. محور الحماية الاجتماعية في خطة الاستجابة كان يتألف من 45 عضواً من منظمات غير حكومية دولية ومحلية، والعديد من الهيئات الدولية، وعدد من المانحين ومنظمات الأمم المتحدة والقطاع الحكومي والقطاع الخاص. تشاركنا في مرحلة الإعداد لمحور الحماية الاجتماعية، وسنتشارك في مرحلة التنفيذ والتمويل. في هذه الخطة أدركنا الحاجة إلى تحسين آليات الحماية الاجتماعية والتخفيف من حدة الفقر للفئات الضعيفة على المستويات الوطنية والمحلية. أدركنا أهمية فعالية التنسيق بين المبادرات على مستوى الحكومة وعلى مستوى المجتمع المحلي. وبالرغم من أن خطة الاستجابة الوطنية شملت مشاريع موجهة للاجئين، منها مثلا توسيع برنامج الدعم النقدي والعيني المقدم للاجئين، ودعم تعزيز الإجراءات والآليات لضمان وصول اللاجئين السوريين للحدود الأردنية، وتقليل المخاطر